In the 1960s, some cars had a feature that could decapitate you in a crash. And that's not even the craziest thing on our list. Seat belts that choke you, steering wheels that impale you, and bumpers filled with water. These are some of the automotive designs gone wrong. So get ready, because in this video we count down 10 of the strangest and even dangerous car features ever invented. Number 10. Neck seat belts. In the 1960s, you're cruising down the highway, and instead of a regular seatbelt, you've got what feels like a fancy scarf wrapped around your neck. Sounds comfy, right? Wrong. Some genius car manufacturers thought, hey, you know what would prevent whiplash? Strapping people's heads down. So they came up with neck seatbelts. These were experimental seatbelts that wrapped around your neck instead of your chest. The idea was to hold your head and neck in place during a crash. Now, I don't know about you, but the last thing I want in a car accident is something yanking on my neck. These neck belts could cause serious neck injuries or even strangulation. Thankfully, this idea was removed pretty quick. By the late 1960s, everyone realized that maybe choking drivers wasn't the best safety strategy. They switched to shoulder belts and headrests instead. You know, things that actually work. Number 9. Wrist twist steering system. In the mid-1960s, Mercury decided that steering wheels were just too wheelie. So they came up with a wrist twist steering system. Instead of a wheel, you got two small dials, one for each hand. The idea was to improve visibility and make driving more comfortable. No more wheel blocking your view of the gauges. Plus, you could drive with your arms on the armrest like some kind of lazy boy recliner on wheels. But trying to control a car with what essentially amounts to two oversized volume knobs is about as easy as trying to eat soup with a fork. Drivers found it confusing and counterintuitive. Imagine trying to make a sharp turn by twisting your wrist like you're opening a stubborn jar lid. Not exactly intuitive, is it? Safety concerns quickly arose. In a crash, there was nothing substantial for the driver to brace against. Plus, the lack of resistance in the dials meant drivers had less feedback about what the car was doing. Needless to say, this twist on steering didn't last very long. By the 1970s, the wrist twist system had spun its way into the history books, leaving us with a good old steering wheel. Number 8. Propeller-driven cars. Back in the 1930s and 40s, some folks thought, you know what cars need? Airplane propellers. So they strapped aircraft propellers onto cars. It's like someone watched too many Looney Tunes cartoons and thought, yeah, that looks safe. These cars, like Marcel Liot's Helica, were supposed to bring the thrill of flight to the open road. But these propeller-driven cars were not practical at all. The exposed rotating blades were just a nightmare waiting to happen. One wrong move and you could slice and dice anything unfortunate enough to get too close. Plus, these cars handled about as well as a shopping cart with a jet engine. Unsurprisingly, this idea crashed and burned. By the 1950s, people realized that maybe, just maybe, giant spinning blades and public roads don't mix. Who would have thought? Number 7. Pop-out windshields. Now here's a feature that sounds like it came straight out of a James Bond movie. In 1948, the Tucker Corporation introduced pop-out windshields. Yep, you heard that right, windshields that could pop out of the car. The idea was that in case of an accident, the entire windshield would pop out in one piece, giving passengers an escape route. Kind of like having an ejection seat, but for your windshield. Tucker used a special rubber gasket that would allow the windshield to pop out cleanly. Sounds pretty clever, right? Well, not so fast. While the intention was good, the execution left a lot to be desired. For starters, in a severe crash, the last thing you want is your main protection against flying debris suddenly deciding to take a vacation. Plus, there was the small issue of occupants potentially being ejected through the very opening that was meant to save them. Imagine surviving a crash only to find yourself launched through the windshield like a human cannonball. not exactly the grand exit that most people are looking for. By the 1950s, advancements in safety glass made pop-out windshields obsolete. Turns out, keeping the windshield firmly attached to the car was a better safety strategy. Number 6. Metal dashboards. Back in the early days of automobiles, dashboards were essentially bare metal panels. No padding, just cold, hard steel staring you in the face. Now, how bad could it be? Well, imagine hitting the brakes hard and instead of an airbag, you're greeted by what's essentially an anvil with gauges. In a collision, these metal dashboards turned into wrecking balls, ready to whack unfortunate passengers. Companies like Ford, Chevrolet, and Dodge all embraced these metallic monstrosities. They were simple, sturdy, and looked pretty sleek. The problem? They obviously were not as safe as you might have guessed. It wasn't until the 1960s that people started to think, hey, maybe surrounding drivers with metal surfaces isn't the best idea. And so gradually manufacturers began adding padding and softer materials to dashboards. Now, if you think metal dashboards were bad, just wait until you hear about these next features. In the top 5, we're going to dive into some seriously questionable car design choices. But before we get into it, could we please ask you a small favor? If you have enjoyed the content so far, help us grow our small channel by taking a quick second to like this video and subscribe. Over 98% of viewers who watch our videos do so without subscribing. It costs you absolutely nothing, but it is a really huge help for us, so thank you. Number 5, lack of headrests. Imagine you're cruising down the highway in your 1960s muscle car looking cool as can be. Suddenly, someone rear-ends you. Your body stays put thanks to the seatbelt, but your head? Well, it keeps on going, snapping back like a Pez dispenser. It wasn't until the late 1960s that headrests started to gain traction. Volvo, always the safety nerds, made them standard in 1968. Other manufacturers dragged their feet, apparently thinking that neck injuries were just part of the driving experience. The lack of headrests was a real pain in the neck, literally. Without them, passengers were at a much higher risk of whiplash and other neck injuries in rear-end collisions. It's like car manufacturers forgot that humans have these things called necks that prefer not to be violently jerked around. By the 1970s, headrests finally became mandatory in many countries. Turns out supporting your head is actually pretty important. Number 4, non-collapsible steering columns. Before the late 1960s, cars came equipped with what we now call the driver kebab maker, non-collapsible steering columns. These were rigid metal rods connecting your steering wheel directly to the wheels. Well, it was all fun and games until you got into a crash. In a collision, that sturdy column turned into a spear aimed right at the driver's chest. Companies like Ford, Chevrolet, and Chrysler all used these death poles. These columns had zero give, meaning all that crash energy went straight into the driver. Thankfully, in 1967, GM woke up and introduced the first collapsible steering column. These new designs could crumple upon impact, absorbing energy instead of transferring it to the driver's ribcage. It's amazing how not impaling the driver became a real selling point. Number 3, water balloon bumpers. Okay, now here's a feature that sounds like it came straight out of a cartoon. In the 1970s, someone thought, what if we filled car bumpers with water? And thus water balloon bumpers were born. The idea was simple. Fill the bumpers with water to absorb impact during a crash, like giving your car a built-in cushion. Sounds great in theory, but not so much in practice. These water-filled bumpers were about as reliable as a paper umbrella in a hurricane. They'd often burst on impact, leaving your car vulnerable and creating a mini flood on the street. Taxi fleets in New York and San Francisco gave these a shot, probably thinking that they would save on repair costs. Instead, they ended up with cars that leaked like sieves. By the 1980s, people realized that maybe water and car crashes don't go along, and this idea dried up. Number 2, swing-away steering wheels. It's 1961. You're sliding into your brand new Ford Thunderbird. And instead of squeezing past the steering wheel, you just swing it away. Sounds fancy. Well, Ford thought so when they introduced the swing-away steering wheel. The idea was to make getting in and out of the car easier. You park, and the steering wheel swings to the side, giving you a clear path. But here's the catch. What if that swanky mechanism decided to take a swing while you are cruising down the highway? These swing-away wheels were prone to mechanical issues. Sometimes they'd get stuck, leaving drivers momentarily trapped behind an immovable wheel. Other times they'd swing unexpectedly, turning a simple drive into a white-knuckle thrill ride. And so by the 1970s, the swing-away wheel faded into obscurity, joining the ranks of the cool but deadly car features. And number 1, lap seatbelts only. So let's wrap things up with a feature that's half-baked at best. Lap-only seatbelts. For a long time, if cars had seatbelts at all, they were just a strap across your lap. It's like someone looked at a roller coaster safety bar and thought, yeah, that'll do for a 2-ton vehicle going 70 miles per hour. Okay, now, well, don't get me wrong, lap belts were better than nothing. They did a decent job of keeping you from flying through the windshield. But they did absolutely nothing for your upper body. In a crash, your lower half stayed put, while your upper body kept on moving, like your torso was trying to headbutt the dashboard. These lap belts were standard issue in cars throughout the 1960s. Companies like Ford, Chevrolet, and others thought that they were the best for safety. But the real problem with lap belts was the increased risk of spinal and internal injuries. Sure, you might not get ejected from the car, but you could end up folded like a human taco. It wasn't until the late 1960s and early 70s that 3-point seatbelts became the norm, finally giving our upper bodies the hug that they desperately needed during a crash. So the next time that you hop in your boring, safe, modern car, take a moment to appreciate all the wacky ideas that didn't make the cut. And if you've got any other wild car stories of your own, drop them down in the comments below. Until next time, keep your eyes on the road.